If you've ever worn historical clothing, or even just watched someone do so, you've probably heard the same question asked again and again. But how do you pee in that? It's a fair question. Layers of skirts, corsets, petticoats, bustles, hoops, and sometimes literal steel cages can look intimidating. Modern clothing is already complicated enough, and we only have 1 to 3 layers most of the time. So, how did women manage hundreds of years of fashion without modern underwear or elastic waistbands? Today, we aren't just going to answer that question. We're going to walk through the entire history of women's underpants and explain exactly how restroom logistics worked in each era. And because demonstration helps more than description, I'll also be physically showing how these garments function. Don't worry, for every demonstration, I'll be wearing black leggings underneath, so you always know what areas represent the body, keeping this family-friendly. Instead of a toilet, I'll be using a chair to represent a privy seat or chamber pot. That keeps everything clean, simple, and historically accurate to the kinds of toilets people actually used. Let's begin with the basics. What kinds of bathrooms existed throughout history? Historical toilets, the 3 main options. For most of history, people didn't have the flush toilets we take for granted. Instead, there were a few common setups. The outhouse. This could be a separate tiny building outside the home, usually with a simple wooden seat over a pit. The wealthy version might be built into the stone walls of a castle, so waste could drop outside. Sometimes houses had a semi-detached alcove or walkway, so you didn't have to walk into the rain to reach the outhouse. The privy chair. This was basically a chair with a hole in the seat. Chamber pots sat beneath it, and the user simply sat down and did their business. These could be portable and moved from room to room. The chamber pot, or bordalo. The chamber pot was a small ceramic pot kept under the bed or in the corner. The bordalo was a smaller version, shaped more like a gravy boat, designed to slide under skirts for semi-standing use. These could be brought to the person instead of the person going to the toilet. Most social classes owned chamber pots because they were essential for nighttime use, children's potty training, illness, or simply convenience. However, since nearly all the clothing I'll discuss today is fashionable, structured, or layered clothing worn by wealthier women, I'll be demonstrating with a chair because wealthier households almost always had a privy seat, or at least a place where one could sit rather than squat. Now that we've covered toilets, let's get to the part you're really curious about. What did women actually wear under all those skirts? For most of recorded history, the truthful answer is simply nothing. Women did not wear what we think of as underpants. Their primary undergarment, for centuries, was a shift, also called a smock, or chemise, depending on the era and location. The name changed, but the garment stayed the same, a simple, loose linen underdress made of rectangles. It was the layer that absorbed sweat, oils, and bodily fluids, protected expensive outer clothing, was easy to wash and replace. The chemise was the underwear, and because it was a dress, everything underneath the skirts was completely open. That meant Using the bathroom was simple. Lift your skirts and oh. This system worked beautifully for centuries. As fashion evolved, more layers were added: corsets, petticoats, quilted skirts, structured silhouettes. But until the early 19th century, none of that included underpants. When underwear enters the chat, the Regency-era underpants, for women only, start appearing in the early 1800s, particularly during the Regency era. Dresses of this period were extremely thin, often sheer, and clung to the body. So some women chose to wear long pantalettes, thin ankle-length pants made of lightweight cotton or linen. But here's the catch. They weren't really underwear as we think of it. They were often purposely visible under short or airy dresses. They weren't universal. Many women still skipped them. They were a modesty layer, not a functional bathroom layer. They didn't solve any practical problem. They solved a fashion preference. True functional underwear doesn't really begin until skirts become shorter and fuller again in the 1830s, 1950s. Split drawers, the genius of 19th century underwear. As skirts ballooned into enormous dome shapes during the Romantic and early Victorian eras, women adopted a new kind of underwear: split drawers, also known as open crotch drawers. These were trousers with two separate legs and no crotch seam. They were open from front to back. Why? Because women still needed the ability to pee without undressing. These drawers were worn over the chemise and under the corset. The chemise was tucked into the drawers, effectively forming a barrier of fabric between the legs while still allowing full access for bathroom use. The open crotch also prevented the discomfort and hygiene issues that would come from a tightly sewn crotch under multiple skirts and layers. How to pee in split drawers. It was incredibly simple. Gather the skirts, ideally grabbing the structured petticoat for control. Lift everything upward. Sit on the privy seat or hover over the chamber pot. The split crotch area naturally opens for use. Afterwards, drop the skirts and tuck the chemise back into place. Because the drawers were roomy and the chemise created coverage, modesty wasn't a practical concern, and surprisingly, this method remained normal for over half a century. The complication: hoops, bustles, and giant underskirts. As the mid-19th century progressed, women began wearing cage crinolines, hoop skirts, bustles, multiple structured petticoats, heavy trains. These could be several feet wide or long, which made the simple just lift your skirts method more awkward. This is where chamber pots, brought to the wearer, became more common. Historical tip: when wearing a massive hoop skirt or bustle, it is far easier to pee facing the toilet backwards. You lift the front of your skirts only, widen your stance, make sure the chemise is out of the way, and sit down. This avoids crushing the structure and makes repositioning skirts afterwards much easier. Brides today often rediscover this trick accidentally or after struggling in a bathroom stall with a hoop petticoat for 10 minutes. Closed crotch drawers arrive. But people aren't impressed. In the 1860s, a new invention appeared: closed crotch drawers. These were similar to modern underwear, but had a waistband that opened in the back, a butt flap panel that buttoned into place. To use the bathroom, the wearer would unbutton the flap, tuck it out of the way, lift the skirts, and then rebutton afterwards. While clever, this system was slower and more frustrating than open drawers. Women preferred convenience, so closed drawers didn't become mainstream until the 1910s, about 50 years later. Why so slow? Because open drawers worked. They were easy, functional, fast, comfortable, and compatible with the silhouette of the era. The union suit and combination underwear. Another major development was the union suit. Yes, the classic red long underwear associated with cowboys and lumberjacks, but originally also worn by women. These full-body knit garments combined the chemise, the drawers. They often had open crotches or overlapping flaps. Later, woven versions called combinations served similar functions. These garments kept the body warm and reduced bulk under corsets. Combination underwear sometimes replaced both the chemise and drawers when knit, or replaced drawers and corset covers when woven. Either way, the crotch remained accessible for bathroom use. The envelope chemise and the dropped seat revolution. The early 20th century brought long-line corsets that extended down past the hips. This made the usual underwear shapes difficult to use because the crotch couldn't be too high. It needed to sit low enough to function under the corset. Enter the envelope chemise, which buttoned at the crotch with a flap shaped like an envelope closure. It hung low, sometimes almost to the knees. Later versions had separate rectangle panels that buttoned either at the front or the center. These required the wearer to reach between the legs to fasten them, which wasn't convenient but was manageable. The trick with old flap-style underwear was to tuck the flap into the corset when using the bathroom, so it didn't swing back unexpectedly. By the early decades of the 20th century, women's undergarments were undergoing one of the most dramatic transformations in fashion history. After centuries of layered chemises, drawers, combinations, and other cleverly engineered garments with adjustable openings, women finally encountered a new style that would shape the future of everyday dressing: the modern panty. The shift truly began in the 1920s, a decade famous for its rapid cultural change. Women were moving, working, dancing, and expressing themselves in ways that demanded simpler, more practical clothing. The underwear of earlier eras, ingenious but often fussy in construction, no longer suited the pace of modern life. Enter a new garment, a lightweight, pull-on piece of underwear that resembled what we now call panties. Unlike the drawers or combinations before them, these new panties did not feature open crotches, overlapping flaps, or buttoned panels. To use the bathroom, they needed to be pulled down entirely. However, this innovation came with an interesting twist that many people today don't realize. During the 1920s, women continued to wear foundation garments, Corsets had evolved into more flexible shaping devices known as girdles. These girdles provided the sleek, tubular silhouette that defined the fashionable flapper look. Slim hips, smooth lines, and minimal curves under the decade's straight, drop-waisted dresses. Because the girdle played a central role in shaping the body, it needed to remain firmly in place throughout the day. Removing it whenever one used the bathroom would have been inconvenient and time-consuming. The solution was wonderfully logical. Women wore their new panties over the girdle rather than under it. This allowed them to simply slide the panties down when necessary, while the girdle remained untouched. In essence, the panties became a removable outer layer, while the girdle acted as the stable foundation beneath. This small but practical choice marked a critical turning point in the evolution of underwear. It demonstrated how the garment was gradually transitioned from an engineered, structural piece of clothing into something softer, simpler, and more personal. By the end of the decade, open-crotch underwear, once considered the standard for convenience, had nearly disappeared from mainstream fashion. The closed panty design, even with its relative inconveniences, better aligned with contemporary views on modesty, hygiene, and the increasing emphasis on streamlined silhouettes. The shift also reflected a broader cultural movement. Women were demanding comfort, autonomy, and modernity in every aspect of their clothing. Thus, the 1920s did more than introduce a new garment. They established the essential form of women's underwear that continues into the present day. The panty, worn over shaping garments before eventually becoming the primary underlayer itself, symbolizes the moment when practicality, style, and modern living converged. This period marks the true beginning of what we now recognize as modern women's underwear, and the quiet end of the open crotch tradition that had shaped centuries of daily life. A popular modern image of the past imagines women struggling helplessly inside layers of baffling clothing. Corsets that required fainting couches, skirts that mobilized, seeking bare, packing, white, own, mass, animal, and undergarments so complicated that daily life must have been a constant battle. But this picture says far more about modern assumptions than historical reality. When we look closely at how undergarments were actually designed and worn, a very different and far more practical story emerges. First, it is essential to recognize that for most of history, women's foundational garments were created, modified, and perfected by women themselves. While men often dominated tailoring guilds or high fashion, the intimate architecture of daily underclothes evolved primarily in the hands of women, mothers, daughters, midwives, and communities of skilled makers who knew exactly what their bodies needed. These garments were refined across generations, not through theoretical design, but through lived experience. Their purpose was comfort, mobility, and functionality. One of the clearest examples of this practicality is in the way historical undergarments accommodated basic bodily needs. The open crotch structure of drawers or shifts, for instance, seems bizarre only from the perspective of people accustomed to modern, closed underwear. In reality, the design allowed women to use the chamber pot, outdoor latrine, or privy without the struggle of removing multiple layers, something that would have been genuinely inconvenient in cold climates, rural settings, or heavy skirts. Far from being awkward, these garments made bathroom use faster and easier than the jeans, leggings, shapewear, and jumpsuits that often challenge modern wearers today. It is also important to dispel the belief that historical clothing restricted movement more than contemporary fashion. Throughout many eras, the majority of women worked physically, cooking, laundering, farming, carrying children, and managing households. Their clothing had to allow bending, lifting, walking long distances, and performing repetitive labor. The idea that they did all this while trapped in uncomfortable, time-securing garments misunderstands how everyday dress evolved. In fact, layering systems were intentionally optimized so garments stayed secure, permitted airflow, and could be adjusted quickly. Another modern misconception concerns complexity. Today's shapewear, sports bras, and structured underlays can be tight, synthetic, and genuinely difficult to get on and off. Many people find that these garments place pressure on the ribs, restrict breathing, or require awkward contortions to remove. Meanwhile, much historical underwear, linen shifts, stays, drawers, and petticoats was made from breathable natural fibers, fastened with ties instead of rigid elastic, and could be donned in a familiar daily rhythm. Once you know the method, these garments are often simpler and quicker than modern alternatives. Ultimately, the past was not a landscape of constant discomfort. It was a world with different needs, technologies, and expectations. Needs that women's clothing met thoughtfully and efficiently. Historical undergarments were tools designed for real lives, not obstacles to be endured. The suffering is a myth. The practicality was real. So, how did women pee in all those historical outfits? With surprising ease. Whether wearing open drawers, split combinations, union suits, envelope chemises, or even early closed drawers, the designs were created with bathroom practicality in mind. The majority of historical silhouettes, even the giant hoop skirts, were more bathroom-friendly than modern tight denim or synthetic shapewear. I hope this deep dive into the history of women's underpants has been as fascinating for you as it was for me to share. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like or subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Of course, Noodles says goodbye too, even if he's getting a bit too large to fit on my lap during these videos. I hope Noodle was.